what is in the People Playbook, that's be clear about your goals and communicate with massive clarity to your team what you're trying to accomplish. And the second area that I'd really reinforce is focus on the basics. Don't disrupt people management. Don't disrupt basic things that bring stability to your organization. You want your organization to be able to function and have a narrower window of what really needs to be special and unique for you as an org. So be brilliant at the basics, I think, is a really key idea.
Hey everyone, my name is Henry Suryawirawan, and you're listening to the Tech Lead Journal podcast, the show where I'll be bringing you the greatest technical leaders, practitioners, and thought leaders in the industry to discuss about their journey, ideas, and practices that we all can learn and apply to build a highly performing technical team and to make an impact in your personal work. So let's dive into our journal. Hello again, my friends and my listeners. Welcome to the Tech Lead Journal podcast, a podcast on technical leadership and excellence. If you haven't, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app to get notified for new episodes. Tech Lead Journal also provides bite-sized contents on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. My guest for today's episode is Andrew Bartlow. Andrew is the co-founder of the People Leader Accelerator and the author of Scaling for Success. In this episode, Andrew discusses the common challenges faced by high-growth organizations and offers strategies for successful scaling. He emphasizes the significance of organizations creating a unique people's playbook and cautions against blindly adopting best practices from other companies. Andrew highlights 7 essential people practices organizations should prioritize, which includes organizational structure, learning and development, and culture and engagement. I hope you enjoy listening to this episode and learning the importance of establishing a people playbook. Please share it with your colleagues, friends, and communities, and leave a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So let's go to my conversation with Andrew after some quick words from our sponsor. Hey, a quick message from me. Thank you for being part of the Tech Lead Journal community. This show wouldn't be the same without your ears, and you are the reason this show exists. Creating this podcast is a labor of love, but the truth is, it also takes time, resources, a whole lot of passion, and an extra bit of caffeine. So, if you're loving TLJ and want to see it keep on growing, consider becoming a patron at techleadjournal.dev/patron or buying me a coffee at techleadjournal.dev/coffee. Every little bit helps fuel the research, editing, and sleepless nights that go into making this show the best it can be. Thanks for being the best listeners any podcast could ask for. Hello everyone, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today, it's a bit different episode. My guest today doesn't come from technical background per se, but he's from the people side of the background. Today, I have Andrew Bartlow here. Really happy to have the chance to discuss with you today because I think people management, people organization is something that I also have passion to research about or study about so that we can all learn how to actually scale organization, especially in a high growth organization. So Andrew, thank you so much and welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hey, really glad to be with you.
Andrew, I always love to start my conversation by asking my guests to actually share a little bit more about yourself. And if you can share with us your major highlights or turning points that we all can learn from, that would be great.
Well, I'm a lifelong or at least career-long HR guy, human resources. I've been in this field for coming up on 30 years across a bunch of geographies globally, across a bunch of different industries, not just tech, but certainly including tech. And maybe rare within the HR world, I actually intended to get into HR. I didn't just fall into it. I went to school for this, have all the certifications, and I'm a lifer. So my major highlights, really were making a great choice to enter a strong educational program for HR. I got my master's at the University of Illinois, and actually I just accepted a adjunct faculty position for them. So I'm coming full circle. I'll be teaching the students in the same program that I graduated from many years ago. And that program exposed me to the best academic minds and frankly, the best on-campus recruiting coming out of a really strong master's program. So the market was hot, had a number of different job offers at the time. And these were from companies that were targeting high quality HR people. So right there, that was already an important filter. These were companies that came to campus looking for really strong HR people, not the more administrative, more tactical, more operationally oriented folks. And I started my career with Pepsi. I won't mention every stop I had over the 25 years, but a really meaningful move that I made was about 3 years in at Pepsi. This will date me. We were in the midst of the dot-com boom, and I was tapped to head up human resources at a growing international company as the 25th hire. We were a technology consultancy, already with operations all over the globe. I was number 20 something. We took it to 120 something people. And then with the dot-com bust, we went out of business. So that the cycle of growth and death happened very quickly. And that was my first experience in my early 20s leading the HR function. And for the next couple of decades, I stayed in HR and ping-ponged between high quality enterprise organizations and more entrepreneurial, smaller organizations. And my capstone in-house, I was the Chief Human Resources Officer of what is now an S&P 500 public company called Invitation Homes, or real estate tech company. Back in 2018, I left them and I hung my single shingle as a consultant and I wrote a book that Columbia University published. And today I'm an operating partner for a private equity company. I'm an investor in a number of different venture funds. I do angel investing. And largely, I work with founder led, investor backed tech companies, helping them to be more successful.
Thank you for sharing your story. I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, you have been, in the people line of job, right? And
Yep.
today we'll be learning a lot from your experience and also the book, which is titled Scaling for Success. So you mentioned that you have been working a lot with the tech company, high growth tech company as well. But in the first place, I want to ask you, maybe if you can share, why did you write the book? Because in the background of story of the book, right, you mentioned something very interesting for me. And startup always experience this kind of a stage, right, where maybe it started from a small teams, but suddenly, just like you mentioned your experience, right, you experience a high growth suddenly within
Right.
maybe a year or so. And then, like what made you motivated to come up with the book?
Yeah, I think the root of writing the book was in part based on my location. I live here in the San Francisco Bay Area in the heart of Silicon Valley, and I've seen companies grow massively and the venture industry, really explode. And I've seen and been a part of people and management practices at these high growth organizations across the decade plus period of the war for talent as everyone was trying to grow so quickly as capital was being poured into these companies. And frankly, I found the management practices to be lacking. Frankly, I found that the people management could be done a lot better and in a much more sustainable way. And so I wrote the book with the idea in mind that more leaders and more HR or people leaders could benefit from some of the mistakes I've made along the way and some of the research backed findings that my co author and I could bring to the table. So, to summarize, why did I write the book? To help companies manage their growth better. I saw a huge opportunity in people management.
Yeah. So I've had experience as well in few high growth companies, not only just startup scale ups, but also in big tech companies, right? Where, suddenly in such a short of time, we hire a lot of people.
Yeah.
So definitely very, very challenging, bringing a lot of people in, a lot of cultural differences probably in the beginning as well for those people. And also how to manage, such a large growing number of people suddenly. Maybe if you can give us some common challenges that you normally see in this typical kind of a high growth organizations regarding people management?
Sure, sure. Well, the common challenge is usually the same thing as the most common positive thing that's happening, and that is growth. Like growth is wonderful, and that's what you want, revenue growth, headcount growth. But that also creates its own challenges. More money, more problems. More people, more problems, or at least more complexity. So as you add headcount, you should probably also be adding management layers to your organization. Not everybody can work for the founders although that's often a challenging turning point as well, is founders starting to delegate and hiring a management layer between them. So with headcount growth and the bringing in of new leaders and new managers, that can accelerate your organization and help you meet your product roadmap a lot faster, or it can be really difficult for your organization to adapt. I joke a little bit in the book, you can burn up the competition or you can burn the house down from the inside. And having a strong management strategy in place can help you get the best rather than the worst out of a growing organization. Maybe one more comment around a typical challenge, and that is changing tracks. It's changing your mindset about what got you here was being very entrepreneurial and quick and dirty and fast and iterate. But what gets you through scaling is adoption of more process and a little bit more structure. And that can be really hard for entrepreneurial founders to accept. What got your startup off the ground was you making stuff happen. What will help you scale is adding some process and some structure to how you operate.
Yeah, or there's this phrase, what got you here won't bring you there, right? So I think
That's
that's
right.
always a good learning. And what I can see as well for many startups and founders or co-founders, right, they are not probably experienced in all this people management. I think that's also one challenge by itself, where they probably need really, really a lot of guidance on how to set up these processes, this structure. They need to start thinking about people. Maybe it's a benefit, performance management, or maybe firing people, bad
Yeah.
performers and things like that.
Well, I just want to reinforce what you're saying there. Like a lot of founders are technical founders or they're business founders. It tends to be people on either ends of their life and their career, like very early stage life and career or very late stage life and career. And the very early stage are the folks that are, typically getting the venture funding and need to learn a number of disciplines that they don't know already. And I'd suggest that they should strive for a Goldilocks zone. Like, don't be so focused on your people that you're afraid to make the tough calls and change people out or hold people accountable or be clear about what's expected of them. But also, don't treat people like they're disposable, and you can certainly move into micromanagement, very quickly. So I write about the archetype of a prophet who's a great visionary but can't execute, or a mule driver who is really hard on the team and believes themselves to be the only decision maker. And neither one of those archetypes are ideal, but striving for that spot in between where you can get results and do that while bringing your team with you.
Yeah, in your book, you mentioned that all these type of companies need is actually a people playbook, right? When do you think those founders should start thinking about this kind of playbook? In your book, you mentioned there are a few stages that probably all founders have to go through. And maybe if you can elaborate in a high level, what kind of stages that we should think about when we want to build or iterate on our people playbook?
I don't know if now, a couple years after having written the book, it's been released for a while now, if I agree with the concept that everybody needs a people playbook or that it's a single people playbook. I think your plays change over time, and so should your company. And so, like, I guess as a comparison, if I have two young daughters and they play soccer, and the plays that they run for their under 10-year-old soccer team will be different than the plays that a high school team runs, which will be different than the plays that a professional soccer team would run. And so too in business. Like, you should have different plays at different stages of your evolution. So I don't think there's one playbook, but more generally, like, what is in the people playbook, that's be clear about your goals and communicate with massive clarity to your team what you're trying to accomplish. Now, clarity doesn't mean detail. Like, I see a lot of groups go way too far on OKRs and monthly or quarterly individual goals. You can really overdo it, but clarity at the company or team level is really essential. And I think maybe a second area that I'd really reinforce is focus on the basics. Lots of startups get wrapped up in trying to do everything or trying to recreate everything, or we're special in every way. And boy, I would just really encourage disruptive organizations to try to disrupt the product or service that you have a startup in the area of, but don't disrupt accounting. Don't disrupt people management. Don't disrupt basic things that bring stability to your organization. You want your organization to be able to function and have a narrower window of what really needs to be special and unique for you as an org. So be brilliant at the basics, I think, is a really key idea.
Yeah, when you mentioned about these basics, I think a lot of startups normally adopt best practices from, other scale ups or successful big tech companies, right? Things like having perks, having, this foosball table or something
Right.
like that. So what is your thought about, adopting best practices from these kind of companies?
Yeah, I have a strong reaction to the idea of lifting and shifting, air quote, best practices from some company that is very unlike yours. I think it's really dangerous. If you read about what Google does or what Meta does or what Elon Musk is doing at Tesla, how similar is that organization to your little startup that has 20 people that are spread across the world that might not even have seed funding yet? Like the practices at big, successful, profitable, mature organizations that have been around for decades should be like it's a different playbook. It should be different than what you're doing at the very early stages. And likewise, let's say that you've raised a couple rounds of institutional capital. Maybe you're on Series C. Seed will be different than C, which will be different than public company. You should just expect that. So I think that best practices are a trap in a lot of cases. And you should really start with first principles thinking. What's best for us? What do we need? Or at least apply a critical eye. Not everything needs to be new. I just talked about be brilliant at the basics and don't recreate everything. So, once again, here's a Goldilocks zone. Don't lift and shift what other people are doing. Don't recreate everything new, but find that spot where it works for you and just apply some critical thinking before you use somebody else's best practice.
Yeah. So maybe also in the past, right, where funding was easy, there are a lot of money around, right? People can spend more. But I think we are in the current era where funding starts to dry up. People starts to think about revenue and profitability, and probably that also brings down a lot of this kind of a fancy people management tactics, right? So I think it's always good to find the right spot that works for all of us. In your book, you also mentioned these two kind of key milestones in typical high growth organizations, which is the crisis of leadership and crisis of autonomy. When I read that part, I find it very insightful. Maybe if you can give us some explanation about these two stages.
Well, I really borrow that thinking from a great management scholar, Larry Greiner, who wrote about evolution and revolution in organizations way back in the 1960s for Harvard Business Review. So, like, this is an example of some research that's been around, some ideas that have been around for a long time, but may not have entered the popular discourse, may not have been talked about as much as they could. So, to your question, what is this crisis of leadership? In the very early stages, many organizations and startups are intentionally chaotic. It's everybody working on everything, generalists, making stuff happen, getting stuff done. And you're able to do that because you're a small group that's highly committed, that probably knows each other pretty well. That sort of startup is, again, very archetypal and typical. But once you get a little larger, once you get to 20-ish people, at that point, your founder or founders probably can't manage every single person. If you have 20 people, can a founder like really know what everybody's working on all the time? Probably not. Can you have regular contact with all those 20 people? Yeah, but it's probably a light touch. So at some point in there, there needs to be more direction. And that's the crisis of leadership. When you move from that chaotic figure stuff out environment to you've got enough scale that you need to bring some clarity, some communication, a little bit of process and structure. You're probably bringing in your first manager sometime, getting close to 20 people, maybe sooner than that, or moving somebody into that role. So that's the crisis of leadership, is where you need to start formalizing some things. And I think that's a very common and predictable stage to go through. And knowing that that's a challenge as you get to a certain headcount can help you move through it more successfully. The second crisis that you mentioned, and actually Greiner spells out several and correlates that to a number of different elements inside an org. Strongly recommend, if it's in the show notes, the audience Googles Larry Greiner. Some really good stuff out there. Another crisis that organizations can predictably face is the crisis of autonomy. So usually the solution at one stage becomes the problem at the next. So we just talked about you need to have some process and some structure in the 20-ish people. Many founders do that, kicking and screaming, resisting with every ounce of their core. But then they start to build the process and structure and they see what it can do and they fall in love with it and they go too far. The pendulum has swung. And then everything is being tracked by everybody. Individuals have OKRs. You overdo, you move into micromanagement. And typically that'll happen in the 50 to 100 headcount range. Not for everybody, and some organizations get there sooner and some get there later. But if you can name it, if you can name like, hey, we're moving into the crisis of autonomy, or we're moving into micromanagement. People don't want to be there, don't want to admit it, but you're probably tracking stuff that you don't need to, and there's too much control in the system. That's a crisis that needs to be resolved through clear delegation, through loosening the reins, through empowering managers. And so these are some typical challenges that organizations face very predictably at certain headcount sizes.
Yeah, thanks for elaborating those two typical crises, right? I think when I read that, I find it really insightful, especially if you have a chance to go through all these cycles. You will typically see these kind of crisis of leadership and crisis of autonomy. And I think one thing that many startups also struggle is about the clarity of the roles as they grew, right? Because, for example, those early members of the team, right, suddenly maybe they got promoted or they got shifted to different types of roles. Maybe if you can elaborate what are some typical challenges you see about these kind of transitions of roles or transitions of skills for those early members.
Sure, sure. Well, there are a couple of concepts at play here. One is moving from generalist to specialist. So as you start out as a very small team, you might be doing product and engineering and design. And then you grow a bit and maybe you separate product from engineering and you look for product experts. And maybe somebody that was pretty good at doing EPD altogether as being like a solo concept. They would come up with a concept, they'd come up with a design, and then they would code it themselves. You're looking for a greater depth in a certain discipline. And that could happen in operations or finance or other areas, sales and marketing as well. So moving from generalist to specialist is a transition that organizations will naturally go through if they're having growth. And that can be hard for the people that were really successful that helped get the company to that next stage, who are great generalists who figured stuff out. But now the expectation is that they're going to lead a group that they don't have nearly the level of depth in that the people that they will need to hire in. So that's a challenge and that's a change process. And some decisions need to be made there around like who will stay with the organization and who will depart. And you can do that in a graceful way or you can, drag it out. And there's also second transition is between individual contributor and manager. So somebody that's doing the work in a hands-on way versus someone that is guiding, directing, leading the work and coordinating the team. I often see startups resist the idea of management in general. Like management isn't real work. We all code here or we're all hands-on and there's pride in that. And that often ends up being counterproductive. Like management is real work. Coordinating, coaching, giving feedback, providing clarity, breaking ties, making decisions. Like if that's not real work, I don't know what is, because that facilitates all the makers, all the developers, all the engineering, all the creation. It needs that guidance. So the move from individual contributor to manager or leader is another transition that's often challenging and really difficult. And then maybe one more, this idea of chaos to structure. There's a great meme for this. I should dig it up. From pirates to Navy. There's this great photo of Jack Sparrow with Johnny Depp, who's the rude and rough looking pirate, to somebody in a very nice starched uniform with shiny buttons in the Navy. And so the idea in a startup is, hey, we're in this kind of chaotic environment where everybody's doing everything and there's pride in doing something different and disrupting, and that's the pirates. But the transition is At some point, you become a real company with people that have mortgages and kids and are looking for health benefits. And they're not all founders anymore. And, for some people, it's a job versus a passion. When does that mix start to shift? When does the ownership start to change? And over time, as your organization grows, your leadership or the culture of your org should probably start to shift towards being more Navy and less pirate over time.
Thanks for giving the overview of typical common challenges or common transitions, right? That all high growth organizations will have to go through. I think all those resonate with me as well. And thanks for sharing that. So, in your book, you come up with, the basics, right? The basic key practices that high growth organizations need to think about. Maybe it's time to dive deep into there. So I think in your playbook, right, you mentioned that companies need to think about a plan. They need to have a plan rather than just go through with the motion and kind of like putting some practices in place from, some best practices out there, but have a plan and then master only the basics. And the last one is actually to consider both the content and the context. But maybe if you can give some overview, what kind of the key practices, what are some of the key practices that leaders or co-founders need to think about whenever they start to come up with this plan?
Yeah, I would break down this problem into a couple of different categories. And important, though, these are kind of false separations. Everything's linked. Everything's connected to everything else. So you can't just focus on one and let the rest sit, usually. So I'll call out these individual areas, but it's really important to think about it like a web rather than individual columns because everything connects to everything else. So a couple areas to think about around people practices and management practices and scale ups. And I'll list them first and maybe we can talk about them in a little bit more depth. Structure. What does your organizational structure look like? Like who reports to who does what, how much autonomy versus empowerment, or how much are you inspecting what you expect? Structure is one. Second area, talent acquisition. How are you finding and hiring, selecting and onboarding new team members? If you're growing and scaling, this is probably a big focus area, talent acquisition. That's area 2. Area 3, I'd label learning and development, particularly in startups that tend to appeal to people that are earlier in their career, that are on a higher growth trajectory. One of the big compelling reasons to join a startup is that there's this widespread belief that your career will grow faster than it would at some big, mature, stable, established organization. So there's an expectation from your team members, generally, I'm speaking generally, that they'll grow. And so how are you delivering on that? But not just that sort of early career expectation. As a growing organization, how are you keeping up? How are you fostering learning and development because your product or service is probably changing and the way that you operate is probably changing very quickly. So learning and development is a key area of focus. Fourth, culture, engagement, and communications. I'll lump these together. So organizational culture, like what does it feel like to work somewhere? How do you operate? Engagement is employee engagement. What's the sentiment of your team? Do they want to be there? Are they expending discretionary effort or are they looking for the next pay raise around the corner and they're just mercenaries ready to go? And communications, I think internal communications, which is often the magic wand. So again, these things are really strongly linked. How are you communicating with your team? What information are you passing on with what cadence? That's a culture, engagement, and communications is a key area. And the last couple, performance management is important. We talked about like some groups can be too slow to move on from valued staff, and some groups can be too quick. And how do you handle that in an organization? So performance management is important. And I think I'd link goal setting there. So call it performance management and goal setting. It's tough to manage somebody's performance if it's not clear what they should be working on or what the expectations are. So I think those are inextricably linked. Another area is legal and compliance. It's an area that's not fun for anybody to focus on. It's a bit of a must do, but it can be a real landmine if you're not aware of some of the most common issues. And it's not hard to protect your company from the most common issues. And so I focus with a bit of a US centric perspective on the legal and compliance matters, but there's some crossover to other parts of the world as well. And maybe underpinning all of these things. So I just listed a bunch of stuff, and a lot of it's kind of HR and management consulting speak. Like, how do you resource it? How do you set up a people team or an HR team or a management team? Like, you can do this with no HR people if you try, but what's the best way to construct a team to help your organization deliver on all these things? And all of these things, again, together, work together. And so you could be fantastic at one and fail at another, and there will be ripple effects across your organization. So I just listed a lot of stuff, and I'm happy to go into as much detail or as little as you like.
Thank you for this overview, right? There are 7 key practices that you outlined just now, right? And also in the book, they become one chapter each, right?
Yeah.
So let's go through some of them because I believe we won't be able to cover everything for sure. Let's go through some of them, which I think I have a lot of interest in. The first one is about organizational structure. I think it's given in almost all these high growth organizations, maybe before they work with the co founders, small team, maybe one team even. And suddenly, when they hire a lot of people, now you need to start thinking about structure, maybe hiring more managers, hiring more leaders, and you start to have layers in between co founders and maybe individual IC. So maybe if you can maybe highlight a little bit what kind of typical problems that we need to think about the structure and what we should do about those problems.
Yeah, I love it. This directly reflects the structure that we have in the book. We try to break it down to what is the problem, what's the plan, and what's a very short list of basics that will be helpful to managers in most situations. So the problem around structure is that as you grow, as you have more workers, more headcount, your complexity explodes. It's actually exponential complexity rather than linear because you have more people with more contacts in between them. So that complexity becomes really challenging to deal with. So generally the plan that my co-author and I would recommend, and shout out to Professor Brad Harris at HEC Paris, my brilliant co-author, there's a short list of things that can help with that. Generally, it's about defining some role clarity. Helping people understand what they should be doing will reduce conflict. And so you can overdo that and you can underdo that. So, shoot for that Goldilocks zone. You can't have a job description that's 17 pages long that gets updated every 3 weeks as your organization changes. And I've seen organizations like really go far as everybody wants more detail. So it's definitely possible to take it too far, but provide clarity around who's doing what and who gets to make what decision. There are a couple of good tools to do that, like a RACI matrix, a responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. It's also known as a DACI or an ARCI or a RASCI. Pick your acronym, but make it clear who does what and how decisions are made. I think another basic around org structure is make sure that your structure makes it clear who makes decisions. Like if you have an engineering leader and a separate product leader and a third peer design leader, who makes the decision there? Does it always go to the CEO at that point because you have three peers and they're expected to sort it out themselves? In that case, if you have three peers and they constantly need to interact on decisions about what your software product will look like or how it will function, you're setting up your organization for conflict. So I would encourage strong role clarity, write it down, and set up structure so that, hey, maybe you have a CTO that sits on all three of them that can make decisions before it has to go to the CEO. Figure out what works for you, but make sure that your structure enables clearer decision making. A couple other areas, and Henry, cut me off if I'm going too long on any of this. Stage appropriate leaders are really important. I don't know if I came up with that term, if I coined it, but I've been using it a lot. And a stage appropriate leader, that's the idea of a generalist versus a specialist. That's the idea of pirate versus Navy. The idea that there's some people whose skills and preferences are better suited for the chaotic early days of make stuff happen, get it done, be a generalist. And there's some people whose skill sets are better suited for a more structured, more process oriented environment with specialists. And as you're building your team, you don't want to get too far ahead of yourself. Like if you have 20 people, you probably don't want to go out and hire a bunch of folks from Google and Walmart. They'll be way outside where you'll be in the near term. But what makes sense for where your organization is now, and ensure that the people that you're bringing in have at least a good mix or a realistic shot at being successful in the environment that you're in and that you're headed towards in the near future. So stage appropriate leaders are really important as you build out an org structure and a management team. And maybe last comment in this area is around structure. There's a concept around, it's a dual concept, span of control. That's how many people report into a manager. Often you'll see a founder or a CEO with a dozen plus direct reports in the very early days because they want to know everything. They're not ready to really empower a manager yet. That's a high span of control. Like think about what a really manageable span of control is. And that span is probably a lot lower when you have people that are geographically spread out, when you have people that are at different career stages, can't be as autonomous or independent, when you have people that are in different functional disciplines. Each one of those things add complexity. So you want to have lower span as you have more complexity. So CEOs, I would suggest their span should be no more than 4 to 6, maybe 8 on the outside to be really effective. And then you think about your organization, you can have high span where you have very similar jobs. Let's say that you have an inside sales team that are constantly doing email marketing, or a lot of people doing a lot of the same thing, or a Zappos call center. They could have 30 people that are under one roof in a call center in Las Vegas that has a call center supervisor over 30 people because it's a highly measurable job. The roles are very similar. The career stage is very similar. So you can have a big span there. So take a look at span. And then the other piece is layers. Often in seeking career growth, people will want to manage other people. That's how you get promoted. That's viewed as a measure of success. How many years have I been a manager and how many people do I manage? I've seen a lot of stacked column organizations develop where you have one person managing one person, managing one person, managing one person for no good reason. And what that does is it creates a lot more distance between the decision makers and the people doing the work. Think about the old telephone game with a can of soup and a string tied between it. Communication fidelity reduces the more layers it has to go through. And so every layer that you have means that those people that are further away understand the decision makers less and have less of an impact and an influence on the people that are making the decision. So try to minimize layers or have a good reason for a layer, and don't just maximize span, but try to optimize span to make sense so that the managers that are in charge of a group can do good work. So happy to explore any of that if that's useful.
Yeah. Really interesting ideas from you. I think all are really relevant, right? As you go through all this organizational structure, some of these questions will definitely pop up. Another question that I typically have in mind when we introduce these kind of structures, I think you covered it a little bit as well, right? About the span of controls and the layers and all that, is about people being politicals, or maybe there's a power dynamics happening when you have this kind of structure. Any kind of tips that you think founders or leaders need to think about this politics and power dynamics?
Oh boy, I mean that's a real challenge, especially as an organization scales and there are personal relationships developed with some of the early hires. I worked at one organization, I'll change the name. Let's say that the founder was named Bob. And again, changing the name, we would joke about Friends of Bob. Friends of Bob got special treatment. Friends of Bob would go talk to the founder CEO and go around 3 layers of management. Friends of Bob were good workers and really valuable, but super disruptive. And the CEO, founder, like wanted to maintain those relationships, valued those people, trusted those people, but they were no longer directly reporting to the CEO for, a lot of good reasons. That's an example of a situation where political dynamics can get awkward, where people start jumping the chain of command, start going around it. And as you get a bigger organization and, you get distance, you get questions, you get lack of clarity, you get partial information along the way. I think the best way to have minimal politics is to write stuff down. If you're operating in an async environment, if you're in a distributed workplace where you're communicating via email, Slack, Notion, various other async tools, write stuff down. Write down what the expectations are. Write down what the product roadmap looks like. write down the user journey, write down what you expect and what the deliverables are. And politics end up usually being a reflection of some form of emotion, some form of fear, trying to look good or look bad. And it doesn't mean it goes away if you resort to written communication, but you have fewer elements of personal dynamics if you're operating in more of an async way.
Yeah, when you mentioned about emotion, I think also leaders need to think about now the psychology of human, right? It's not like you're putting structures, you just put people in a hierarchies or something like that and it all will work. Don't forget about the human aspect, the psychology, the fear, the emotions that got involved with all this as well. So maybe let's move on to the next key practice, which is learning and development. Because I'm sure in a high growth organization, sometimes people crave, okay, what can I do to upskill my skill set? And you also mentioned, for example, those early in their careers, right? Sometimes they don't have enough guidance, or maybe people who transition from IC to manager, how to
Yep.
become a good manager. So tell us about the typical problems and the plan for learning and development.
Yeah, well, you nailed it. Those are the most common situations where you have early career people that are hungry to learn, and you have people that are promoted, especially into managerial roles that are often in over their heads. And what I've seen at most startups I've interacted with is that they don't do too little around learning and development. They do too much. They try to do everything. Like every time somebody asks for something, the answer is either yes, let's do it, great idea, or great idea, go make it happen. There's almost never a, oh, not yet, that doesn't make sense for us, or hey, that doesn't align with our priorities. And I think that balance should probably shift. I think there really needs to be more prioritization as an organization around what learning and development initiatives you take on. So do fewer better and be clear about what those investments are around learning and development because it's not always a ton of hard dollars. Like you're not always buying expensive third-party content or bringing in a consultant like me to go do something. It's usually time. Like if you're trying to develop your own manager skills training, like stop now and go buy it. You can buy it faster than you can build it. It'll be better and ultimately it'll be way cheaper because you're not burning weeks or months building a subpar product that you could get off the shelf tomorrow. So be thoughtful about your investments around learning and development. Don't get stuck saying yes too quickly. Like try to identify a few common core things. And in startups, like what are the common things? You're hiring a bunch of people. So so maybe interview training or candidate selection. How do you do that? If you're growing, or maybe it's customer onboarding or employee onboarding that you need to focus on. Manager skills, we already mentioned that, but if you're growing, chances are new people are coming into the org as managers or new people are being promoted into managerial roles. There's probably something around manager skills that you want to focus on. There may also be something around selling. Like, hey, if you're hiring a bunch, maybe you found product market fit and you just got a new round of funding and now you need to go to sell this thing. So, sales training or sales processes or the support systems around delivering to new customers. Those are probably a few core things that you'll see pretty regularly. And there might be something unique to your org. Depending what you do or what you need, you may have something unique. And that's okay. But I'm suggesting that you don't try to boil the ocean and say yes to everything. Say yes to a few and squash the rest. And it's okay to say no or not yet by focusing on delivering a few things really well. And as part of that, you're deciding what you're doing and you're deciding what you'll do yourselves versus what you'll buy or rent elsewhere. So many startups seem to treat their people's time as if it's free, but time is money. Time is labor. Time is headcount dollars. Time from a team doing a lunch and learn or developing your own manager skills training is time that could be spent doing other things that actually advance your product and your startup forward. So those are a few
Yeah.
basics.
Yeah, you mentioned about time. I was about to ask a follow-up question, right? Because apart from just the content or maybe the instructor, the trainer, do versus buy, is actually to carve the time for people to actually put the time for them to learn and develop themselves. Because in a typical high growth organizations, there are too many things to do. There are so many things to get done. There may be a lot of focus and priorities at the same time. How can you actually motivate people to want to actually learn and develop themselves?
I think that's actually rarely a problem. It's rarely a problem that people don't feel a high level of internal motivation to develop themselves. Again, a lot of people join startups to try to accelerate their career because they're passionate about the mission, because they want to move faster. They see the growth, they want to be part of that. So I think there's actually a pretty strong selection bias from applicants that want growth. So you don't have a lot of that issue. Where you do have an issue is where there might be some training or development that's not obviously connected to something that benefits that individual. Like, hey, maybe you send everybody at the organization through some type of soft skills training that the engineers roll their eyes at. And the engineers say, "Well, how does that help me code in Python today? Like, how does that help us advance our product roadmap? We're like testing our confrontation and conflict skills. Like, I don't get it." That's where you might get resistance. And when you do get resistance like that, that's a sign not necessarily that your team is wrong and they need to be motivated, but that maybe your choices about what you've prioritized for learning and development might not be naturally fitting every group with the same level of fit.
Thanks for that advice. I think we all can learn about learning and development much better because I'm sure a lot of people wants to learn and upskill themselves at the same time also finding the relevant content for them. So let's move on maybe to the third key practice that I want to also learn from you, which is this bucket you mentioned: culture, engagement, and communications. So yeah, what are the typical problems and what are the plans that we need to think about in this area?
With a high growth startup, usually the biggest problem in culture is the founders and the old guard holding on to the past. It's resistance to evolution. And boy, evolution can happen fast, and if you don't watch it, it can turn into revolution. But there can often be this feeling of anxiety or fear or loss of this tight-knit group of people that made something happen, and we went out and got funding and we built this product and we did this thing, and now everything's all corporate, and I don't want to be, some big bureaucratic tech company. So usually the biggest problem around culture is resistance from leadership for the changes that have to happen. And so it's important to know that culture will change whether you like it or not. So as you grow and add headcount, you can choose not to bring in managers. You can choose not to have layers, not to have structure, not to have role clarity, but people will figure it out for themselves. And it probably won't be as effective as you want it to be. It'll probably be a real mess. So you can fight it or you can own it. And so that's the plan. The plan is make some decisions about how you want to operate and share those decisions. Like you could share those in a vision, mission, values statement. You could share those in some operating principles. You could share that in a RACI type of decision matrix. But sharing is important, right? As you grow and scale, being able to communicate with this bigger org that doesn't have the same depth of history with you as a founder as your early hires do. They don't necessarily think the same way that you do or have all the same ideas and learnings that you've gone through in building your company. So it's about communication. It's about trying to get those instincts that are in your head as a founder out to a team that now might have dozens of people in many locations all spread out that might not be working for a common vision unless you're able to describe it effectively. So that's the plan, is communicate how you want to operate. And again, it's hardest for the old guard and the founders. You don't need to have like a fake funeral ceremony. I've kind of laughed about that. I think Oracle did that as they changed from one CEO to another at one point. They like buried the past. You don't have to do anything like really silly and dramatic, but it's okay. And actually, I'd strongly advise be specific about what worked when and what needs to change to be successful in the future. So it doesn't mean whatever you did or however you operated in the past was wrong or bad. That got you where you are now. But being clear about, hey, I as CEO founder can no longer have one-on-ones with every single person. I'd love to, but there just isn't enough of me to go around and have me do all the things that I need to do. So instead, we're going to do all hands on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. That's a change. Another example might be, hey, I know all of you would like to weigh in on the product and the design, and we used to all meet in one room and move the mouse around, or now it's on video and do product demos every week. There are just too many of us now. It's too much time, and not everybody touches it. And so the way that we need to operate is different, and we'll have the product team work on that, and maybe they'll do an office hours once a month for the people that want to attend. So just being very specific like that about what things need to change and how people's roles will change can be really helpful in moving through a cultural transformation. I think there's also something around culture where so many startups are trying to do something new and different, right? I talk about like, don't recreate the wheel. You're maybe not as special as you think you are. You don't have to make up everything new, but be clear about who you are. As we think about culture, I see some startups just try to be everything to everyone. And hey, we want to be completely flexible, and we want to pay everybody at the top end of the range, and we want to only, have the best desk chairs and only the coolest programming language, and we want to do all the stuff. And ultimately, in terms of operations and culture, it's healthy and necessary to make some choices about who you are, what you'll prioritize, and how you'll operate. And so that comes down to figuring out, as a founder, as a leader, how you operate and ensuring that the group understands that. And maybe you need to evolve over time, and that's okay. And you'll change your messages and you'll change your expectations over time. But communication's at the core of all of that. Like, make it clear how you want your group to make decisions, and that will make it easier for you to allow them to make decisions. You can't empower someone unless you trust them, and you can't trust them unless they make decisions that are similar to you. And how can they do that unless you explain how you make decisions and how you prioritize things? So, yeah, I know I'm belaboring the point, but this is often one of the harder emotional things for a founder, CEO to move through. The challenges of growth are really largely around culture.
Yeah. So you mentioned about vision, mission, be clear who you are. I think the company values as well, right? Those things that stay true as the company evolve. I think that's also important to make clear, right? And also, I think the other point is about engagement, right? How do you actually first get the pulse of the employees' engagement? Because as you grow large, maybe you cannot track everyone's engagement for sure. How can you maybe understand what is the sense of engagement for my employees? How can we boost the engagement and things like that? Maybe some, short tips and tricks here as well.
This is actually a favorite topic of mine. I'm a founder myself. I'm building a B2B SaaS product that will do performance management and employee pulse surveys. I think it's really valuable for organizations. Once you get so big that a founder can't talk to everybody and know what everybody's working on and how they feel, to have some method to gather that information. So, lots of organizations like Lattice or Culture Amp or 15Five have a survey tool that you can do engagement surveys. That's okay, but it's really long cycle. It's really expensive, and you can't do it more than twice a year. And you ask not a thousand. You ask a lot of questions. You do action planning for months, and what actually comes out of it? Not a lot. And then you have these big performance management systems, some that I just named, that are intended to help people figure out what they should be working on and how they're doing. But it's just all overbuilt. And so I really think that the best method to stay in touch and stay in tune with your team is to talk to them. Like, the most powerful tool is a one-on-one and a skip level. And the best thing that you can do when you have multiple layers is a skip level every once in a while, or an all hands. Like, just talk to your team. Call it a focus group if you want. Inspecting what you expect out of one-on-ones is kind of the missing piece for a lot of organizations. Like, are your managers actually having useful conversations with the people that work for them? What are they talking about in those one-on-ones? Is it just like reporting the news and doing some light bonding? Or are you actually helping each other and providing feedback about, you're working on the wrong thing, I need you to focus on this other thing right now? So I think there's a real opportunity to enhance the focus on one-on-ones, to inspect what you expect out of your middle managers. And there's some simple tools that you can do it. And I found myself trying to build it in Google Forms, and it wouldn't do all the segmentation I wanted. And now I've gone down a rabbit hole of building a SaaS product.
I really love the simplicity that you emphasize, right? Just talk to the people. You don't always need to build the fancy surveys or buy all these expensive tools. And in fact, yeah, after we collect all those surveys, right, coming up with some action plans itself can be really, really difficult, especially come up with, maybe top 3 or top 5 things that the company needs to do, right? And I think I like what you mentioned about you inspect what you expect, right? Because sometimes, yeah, it's not clear what we expect, and the people are also not doing it as what you expect as well. So thank you so much for this time, Andrew. I really love our conversation. I think in your book you have more tips, more plans, more basics that leaders can learn. And also when they go through all the stages, right, it will be different kind of context that they need to take care about. Before we wrap up, I have one last question that I want to ask you. Typically, I call this 3 technical leadership wisdom, but I think your background is people, so I guess I can call it 3 people leadership wisdom. So think about it just like an advice that you want to give to us for us to learn from.
Oh, wow. Big, broad area. And we've already talked about so much good stuff already. Yeah, how do I boil it down as concisely as possible? Let's start with be clear. That's a people leadership wisdom item number 1. Be clear. Be clear with your team, with your organization, with people that work with you about your expectations, about your goals, about your priorities. Don't avoid the hard conversations. Be clear. Don't leave it up to them guessing. Communication is just so important. I think another area, and maybe this is obvious, but also no matter how big you get, stay human. Continue to show some human empathy. I've worked in organizations with hundreds of thousands of people, General Electric and Wells Fargo and Pepsi, hundreds of thousands of employees. And it can be easy to start to think about people like numbers at some point. And, if you're a founder with a team of 5, you're in no danger of that right now. But as you start to scale and add some layers and you start to think about these management processes, stay human and show some empathy to people because, no telling what somebody else is dealing with. And being empathetic can create a lifelong commitment and relationship. And maybe a last one would be keep it simple. There's a lot that needs to be done at a startup. There's a lot that you can do, but if you're able to focus and prioritize and just do the basics really well, it'll take you really far. So, usually the challenge is trying to do too much too soon. So keep it simple for as long as you can.
Oh, I really love the simplicity of your wisdom, right? Be clear, stay human, and keep it simple. I think it's always good to have this simplicity kind of wisdom so that it really relates to all of us. So, Andrew, if people love this conversation, they want to learn more from your resources, book or, online materials, is there a place where they can find you online?
Yeah, thank you. I am all over LinkedIn. Look for me on LinkedIn, Andrew Bartlow. I'd love to offer your listeners a code to get a free download on my website as well. The main website that I'm on is peopleleaderaccelerator.com, People Leader Accelerator. And there's a section where I have a bunch of guides that are available for download, many of them free, some for a fee. But if you use the code podcast, you can download anything there for free. So, hopefully some of your listeners take advantage of that.
Thank you for the generosity. So I'll make sure to put it in the show notes as well. So again, thank you for your time, Andrew. Really love our conversation. I think people management is something that most of the co-founders will need to learn, right? Sooner than later. So thank you so much for your sharing today.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode and for staying right until the end. If you highly enjoyed it, I would appreciate if you share it with your friends and colleagues who you think would also benefit from listening to this episode. And if you're new to the podcast, make sure to subscribe and leave me your valuable review and feedback. It helps me a lot in order to grow this podcast better. You can also find the full show notes of this conversation on the episode page at techleadjournal.dev website, including the full transcript, interesting quotes and links to the resources mentioned from the conversation. And lastly, make sure to subscribe to the show's mailing list on techleadjournal.dev to get notified for any future episodes. Stay tuned for the next Tech Lead Journal episode, and until then, goodbye.